Well, the Florida Legislature's 2025 session has officially begun. The lawmakers have kicked off what is going to be 60 days in which they'll, debate hundreds of bills, spend billions of dollars, give quite a bit of that money away. The question to watch will be how much of that money they actually give to you and to real living, breathing people versus how much they give away to businesses. I think it's safe to say we're in for an eventful 2 months in Florida now, as a wise man in a dystopian dinosaur park once said, hold on to your butts. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big business influences public policy in this state. Today, though, we're just going to talk about day one of the session. I'm recording this Wednesday morning. Tuesday was the opening day of the session. And, opening days are generally, the focus of them is on the governor's State of the State address, and then also that the opening day remarks of both the Senate president and the House Speaker, the three most powerful people in Florida politics, the three people that largely control the agenda of just which of those hundreds of bills are going to pass, how those billions of dollars are going to be spent, and whether people or businesses are going to get those tax breaks. Typically there's not a ton to be gleaned. You're just kind of looking to get a sense of what the dynamics are, what some of the issues might be. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway from yesterday's opening day is that it's pretty clear that the governor and the legislature are still not on the same page with each other. We're still kind of in this brave new world for Florida, where the Republican controlled Florida legislature is no longer being led or content to just follow Governor Ron DeSantis. They've essentially moved past him. And you saw it in a couple of ways, particularly in the speeches by House Speaker Danny Perez, a Republican from Miami, and the governor's State of the State address, which followed from the very same rostrum. He delivers the speech in the State House chamber. And you had things like Danny Perez sort of vowing to really investigate and expressing anger at insurance companies that have been profiteering in Florida, and also criticizing some of the stupid tax stuff Florida always does, these gimmicky tax holidays that don't actually help people, but really end up subsidizing a bunch of retailers like Walmart by subsidizing their marketing budgets. So he went after that stuff. Ron DeSantis then gives a speech where he defends the state of the insurance industry and calls for the legislature to pass more sales tax holidays. So, already it seems pretty clear they are talking past each other. I think the most significant news, I think everybody would agree yesterday, was out of Danny Perez's speech and his remarks about insurance companies specifically. And so, we actually we recorded a podcast earlier this week or last week, actually, with Lawrence Maurer of the Tampa Bay Times, who released this bombshell report about a report that found that a number of insurance companies had been essentially secretly passing off billions of dollars in payments to affiliates and booking billions of dollars in profits while claiming losses in Florida. And most significantly, this report was essentially hidden from the public for 2 years, particularly not just the public, but from Florida policymakers, Florida legislators who were passing a bunch of insurance industry written laws to help the industry, to stabilize it. So Danny Perez acknowledged that story in his speech and said he has ordered hearings into this report and to learn more. And most significantly, that he's authorized the House's, I think it's the Insurance and Banking Committee. One of the chambers calls it the Insurance and Banking Committee. The other one calls it the Banking and Insurance Committee. It's just like irritatingly complicated. But anyway, whichever one the House is, Danny Perez has authorized them to use sort of their full suite of tools, which include subpoenaing records and bringing in insurance executives and lobbyists and swearing them in, making them testify under oath, which is, legislative historians will correct me, but I don't believe they've made people testify under oath since like 2003, when there was a big war under under former Governor Jeb Bush over medical malpractice insurance in Florida. So, that's a pretty significant power to sort of authorize there. Now, Perez didn't say that they were going to do it. There's obviously no indication yet of where this actually leads, even if they do it, what sort of policy comes out of it, what they learn. But just the fact that he's willing to sort of green light this stuff and sort of make such a high profile announcement of it suggests that, something is cooking. It's sort of like Lawrence Maurer said in that podcast. There's a clear, like, palpable anger in the legislature with the insurance industry because they're all hearing it from their constituents. Nobody in Florida is everybody in Florida is struggling to pay insurance. Whether you're a homeowner or a business owner or a renter who's getting it passed on to you, the rising cost of property insurance in Florida over the last 5 years has been more than that, but the rising cost has been like the dominant issue of the state, and the legislature has done just about everything the insurance industry has asked, and what they've gotten at best is slower rates of increases. And so the contrast there was really interesting with Ron DeSantis, though. He was eventually asked. He did a press conference after his speech where he was asked about this stuff, and essentially he used it to just keep defending all the reforms that they passed. And the reforms, we've talked a lot about this on this podcast, but they fall into two major buckets as far as I'm concerned. They made it far harder to sue insurance companies, for policyholders to fight back against insurance companies that unfairly deny or delay or just drag out claims. And they also drove up the cost of insurance by essentially enforcing price increases at Citizens, the state's nonprofit insurer, forcing rates up there, which gives insurance companies the freedom to raise rates, private insurers more room to raise rates themselves, even to the point where they're like forcing many people out of Citizens into forcing them to accept higher prices from private insurance companies. All of this stuff they've done over the last few years, and Ron DeSantis is out there defending this. And it strikes me this is a dangerous spot for Ron DeSantis to be in, essentially the defender of the status quo, particularly on this one issue. It is one thing, it seems to me, it is one thing to defend all this when Florida Republicans are all in lockstep on the issue, because, I don't think you can find a Floridian out there who's happy with their property insurance situation right now, or not. You can't find a significant number. You can find many who are unhappy, regardless of their party, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever. But the way the reality of politics is that polarization and party loyalty tends to trump a lot of these issues. So, defending this stuff when all Republicans are on the same page about it strikes me as one thing. But if Ron DeSantis is going to end up sort of defending the insurance industry and all the kind of anti-consumer changes, the friendly way to say it, the tough medicine that they made Floridians swallow, if he's going to be defending that stuff himself while a bunch of Republicans are turning on it, that strikes me as a really dangerous situation for him to be in. So anyway, that will obviously be one of the dominant stories to watch, where this goes, where this anger that is clearly exists in the Florida Capitol to the insurance industry, how that actually manifests itself, whether it actually manifests into sort of meaningful policy or any sort of help for consumers, or, hell, at this point, I would settle for passing some reforms that clamp down on some of these financial games, empowered regulators to do more, and ensured some like legit transparency where people outside of the industry can actually look at some of this stuff and make sense of the claims that the insurance industry is making. And there can be some independent fact checking and oversight of this industry. If we get even just that stuff, I would consider that a win, given the direction Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature have gone on insurance the last few years. Also, I mentioned the tax holiday stuff. The other thing that was really interesting, and again, I think is a pretty dangerous situation politically for Ron DeSantis, is, both Danny Perez and Ben Albritton, the president of the Florida Senate, brought up tax cuts in their speech. I mean, no surprise there. Republican legislators love tax cuts. It's par for the course. Everybody knows they're going to cut some sort of tax. But both Perez and Albritton talked about them in sort of different ways. Like, as I mentioned, Danny Perez sort of criticized sales tax holidays, that this is basically the gimmick the legislature and the governor have been using for years to kind of distract Floridians with, like, here, we're giving you this temporary meaningless tax holiday that actually just sort of shifts things around. So rather than actually saves you money, well, we turn around and permanently cut a bunch of taxes for businesses. Danny Perez sort of seemed to make clear that he was not interested in pursuing a lot of sales tax holidays anymore. Ben Albritton, in his quick line about tax cuts, he specifically mentioned helping, and I'm looking at it here just to make sure I get it right, quote, tax cuts for families, seniors, and those less fortunate in Florida. That's great. Ron DeSantis went through a long tax cut package in his tax cut discussion in his speech, and it was all about tax cuts for businesses, particularly cutting what the the big business lobby is called the business rent tax. Essentially, sales tax gets charged on commercial lease payments. The legislature has been cutting that tax down for years, pushed on by like Publix and big businesses in the Florida, big business lobbying groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce. And Ron DeSantis wants to eradicate that completely. That is a tax that only businesses pay. They cut that tax. That is entirely savings for businesses, and it flows overwhelmingly to these large retail businesses that rent lots of commercial lease space, like companies like Publix is a big issue for them. Um, and so we'll obviously go far more in depth into this as we move into session and we start to see more of the tax proposals out there. But if we're setting up a situation where the governor is calling for tax breaks for businesses and the legislature is going to push tax cuts for actual people, again, strikes me as Ron DeSantis is on the wrong side of that issue. Not just sort of like from a values perspective and like policy perspective, but also just politically speaking, it's a bad place to be. So anyway, maybe I'm reading a little too much into one or two throwaway lines and speeches. It's always possible we're getting out over our skis here, but hey, that's what you do when you're doing a podcast about the session on the day one of session. So, okay, real quick, just a couple of other things that stuck out to me. The most interesting thing Ron DeSantis said yesterday in my mind, came in the press conference he did afterwards, where, the governor has started to talk more and more about this idea of dramatically cutting property taxes or getting rid of property taxes entirely, which is, we'll obviously dive more into this, but it's an insane idea. It would make Florida's tax system far worse for the vast majority of people. It is stupid policy from like just pure tax policy perspective. It's not at all conservative. It is horrible from a values perspective as well. We'll go into that in a lot more detail. But anyway, he kind of backed away a bit from some of that stuff and sort of acknowledged that he's going to make a big push on this in the 2026 legislative session. Some of this is timing. All of this, property taxes are controlled by local governments. The legislature, this is a constitutional issue. The legislature is going to have any change is going to have to go on the ballot and in the 2026 election. So you've got some time here. But what Ron DeSantis said was he wants to spend the intervening time, he used this as a verb, doging local governments, essentially rooting out what he is going to call evidence of waste, fraud, and abuse in local governments, and kind of trying to bring the same chaotic wrecking ball that we're seeing in DC that's leading to like park rangers and cancer researchers being laid off, bring that same kind of just destructive approach to cities and counties and local communities across Florida. But what was interesting about this is he kind of acknowledged whatever he's envisioning in his brain, he's going to need some help from the legislature on this. He said we're going to need some. I don't have the exact quote from me, but he said basically we can get some financial information on it, but it's probably gonna need some help from the legislature to really doge cities and counties. So I'm not sure. I'll have to spend a bit more time looking through what's been filed. I don't think we've seen a package necessarily related to that, although it's possible I've overlooked it. So, but that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. And, one of the broader dynamics of the session is just whether or not the legislature is going to start reeling back some of the powers they've given the governor over the last few years or reeling them in in different ways. It strikes me, giving him the power to doge local governments might be going in the other direction. But, if there's one villain that Republicans in Tallahassee are all united on, it's blaming local governments for all the problems, right? It's never Tallahassee's fault. It's always the city and county local elected officials. And my God, there's nothing they love doing more than cutting a property tax where they can take credit for cutting the tax, but they don't have to deal with any of the consequences that come from it because it's all a local government revenue source. So that listening to DeSantis talk about that strikes me as we're going to be seeing that will be a big point of discussion this session, I suspect. Real quick, a couple of other things. Ron DeSantis came out in support of banning fluoride in water. It sounds like he called it forced medication. We had a piece just recently on the newsletter where we said this is in many ways going to be the stupidest legislative session ever. That's another marker in that column, I suspect. More seriously, the legislature on day one started to move a pretty significant environmental bill for the Mosaic company. That's the Fortune 500 phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing giant. We wrote a lengthy story about this issue on the newsletter last week. I think I'll throw a link to it in the show notes. But basically, the bill would insulate Mosaic from lawsuits over formerly mined land. And so, again, I won't go into too much detail, but the process of phosphate mining involves essentially you're strip mining phosphate ore out of the ground, and there's some naturally occurring radioactive materials in that. But the mining process, and then you have to reclaim the land once you're done with it. I mean, you put it back in kind of like they say it's better than the same state. It's like a facsimile of its former state. But the process can also leave the land, make the land more radioactive at the surface, leave higher radioactivity levels at the surface, because you've basically taken radioactive materials that were buried like 30 to 50 feet below ground. And then when you reclaim the land, you leave it buried much closer to the surface. There's a lot of dispute over just how much that increases radioactivity and whether or not it increases radioactivity to the point where it's unsafe to use the land for other things. There's actually a lawsuit. Mosaic is being sued right now in Hillsborough County Court by a couple of folks living in trailer parks atop former phosphate land over this issue. This legislation would, as I said, give Mosaic more legal protections from those kind of lawsuits, essentially make them much harder to both file and win. And it goes far beyond just this one lawsuit. Mosaic, I think a representative from the company testified yesterday that they've got more than 100,000 acres. They own more than 100,000 acres of land that has already been mined and reclaimed. And this legislation is designed to sort of make it easier for Mosaic to develop that land or sell it off to developers for whatever the use may be. And you're talking and think beyond that, Mosaic owns like 300 some odd thousand acres in Florida. So like a lot of land is still being mined or still being reclaimed. The ramifications here, particularly when there's never been like a true resolution to this lawsuit that's going right now, there's some pretty significant repercussions from that. Anyway, this bill, first day of session, the House committee took it up and moved it through its first committee stop. And, in the Florida legislature, if you don't know anything else about it, to just know that the first committee hearing for any bill, that's the most important thing. That's the most important moment for any piece of legislation other than, the final vote and actually passing. So the fact that that bill is now in play and put in play on day one of the legislative session, probably a pretty good sign that it's got juice, as they say. The last thing I will mention today, what from my perspective will be the most important and most significant fight of session, that's about to begin just before the end of the day. The House announced that it is going to begin hearing a piece of legislation, House Bill 1205, I think is the number, that would make it significantly harder for citizen-led constitutional amendments in Florida, petition drives to amend the state constitution. You might remember this is clearly a response to the last election, where there were two petition drives that nearly passed, one to overturn the state's near total abortion ban, one that would have legalized recreational marijuana in Florida. Both got strong majorities of the vote. Abortion was just over 57%. I think marijuana was just over 55%. But in Florida, you need 60% to amend the Constitution. This is a legacy of the big business lobby, which was pissed off at voters for passing an amendment to increase the minimum wage. And they got the legislature to put a measure on the ballot many years ago that required constitutional amendments to get 60% of the vote. It passed with less than 60% of the vote, in one of the most horrible ironies of Florida politics. Anyway, House Bill 1205 will make this process significantly harder. There's a lot in this bill, but for instance, it would require anybody that wants to sponsor a proposed petition drive, a ballot initiative, to put up $1 million right up front, like post $1 million bond. And why do you have to do that? Because it's going to impose all sorts of enormous obstacles and potential fines in it. In some cases, there are fines for like turning petition forms in late. They're like looking to like quintuple and even increase some of these fines by 10 times, And of course, they're also making these deadlines harder to meet. So one of the more significant changes is right now when you're collecting petitions, you have 30 days to turn them in. This would take that down to 10 days. So they're cutting the time you have to turn in petitions by like 2/3. There is a lot more in this bill. I suspect we'll write more about it in the newsletter. I imagine this one will get a lot of attention in a lot of different media because, Florida is a intensely gerrymandered state. I mean, this is how you end up in a state that has, 57% of voters voted to limit government interference with abortion, and yet you've got a legislature that voted to ban nearly all abortion in this state, right? That is the impact of gerrymandering. The vast majority of legislators are absolutely insulated from anything other than primary challenges, which are decided by the furthest extreme of voters. And so one of the only ways around partisan, an intensely gerrymandered state legislature is this petition drive process, is ballot initiatives. This is why both the legislature and the big business lobby want to make this as hard as possible. The legislature, this is a way of it consolidating its own power. For the big business lobby, it's got these guys under their thumbs on the vast majority. I mean, we just talked about Mosaic, a land to help Mosaic develop some radioactive land is, that was a day one bill, right? The big business lobby would love if any major change had to go through the legislature because they know they've got enormous influence there. And so shutting down petition drives is designed to essentially preserve the status quo and protect the big donors that dictate so much of the agenda in Tallahassee. So, this will be an enormous fight. Ron DeSantis has made this one of his biggest issues, so he'll be out there. He's got an even crazier proposal that essentially would allow him to personally write the ballot language. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but honestly, not all that much. It'd give him all these powers to just personally interfere and stop ballot measures that he doesn't like, much in the way we saw him try to do with the abortion and weed measures, where he spent, $20+ million of taxpayer money on ads against them. So anyway, that fight begins Thursday morning. I'll throw a link to the bill in the show notes to just so folks can see what we're talking about. And like I said, we'll be talking a lot more about that in the coming days. So, okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. I don't want these to become too long. So that was day one of the session. We'll be trying to do more of these. They won't be quite daily, I don't think, but they'll, as sort of developments warrant. But we'll try and do them 2, 3, 4 times a week, depending on sort of the activity in Tallahassee. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. That helps us get these videos out to more folks. And then if you haven't already signed up for the newsletter, the easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford it. If you got the means, please think about doing that. Okay, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back again very soon. Take care.